High on the green slope of Mount Vesuvius stands a handsome old building with a story hiding inside it. It is the historic home of the world's oldest volcano observatory. Founded in 1841, when kings still ruled Naples, the building itself is now a museum, but the institution born there never stopped working. Today, its successor, run by Italy's National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology, watches this ground through a modern network of sensors that never sleeps. On the mountain, under the streets, and beneath the sea. Look down from that slope and you will understand why the watching never stops. 3 million people, an entire metropolis, wrapped around the bay like a hand around a flame. This is Naples, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in Europe, with Greek roots reaching back nearly 3,000 years. And in the files of Italy's Civil Protection Department sits a document written for this view. It is an evacuation plan for hundreds of thousands of people, kept updated in the hope that it will never be used. Here is the strange truth at the heart of this story. Much of what made Naples fertile, beautiful, and famous came from the very ground that could destroy it. And before this journey ends, you will learn that the mountain in the postcard may not even be the most restless force in this bay. Nearly 3,000 years in one journey. It begins with a dead siren on a beach. Chapter 1. The Siren's Grave. Every great city has a founding story. Most of them involve a hero, a god, or a conquest. Naples begins with a funeral. According to the legend the Greeks told, there was once a siren named Parthenope. She was one of the creatures from the story of Odysseus, the beings whose singing was so beautiful that sailors steered their ships onto the rocks just to hear it. But Odysseus had been warned. He plugged the ears of his crew with wax, tied himself to the mast, and sailed past unharmed. The sirens had failed for the first time in their existence, and in the version of the myth the Greeks of this coast preferred. Parthenope could not live with that failure. She threw herself into the sea, and the waves carried her body to a rocky headland on a wide, beautiful bay. The people who found her buried her there, and they built their settlement around her tomb. They named it after her, Parthenope. Now, is any of that true? Of course not, at least not as history. But pay attention to what the legend is actually saying, because founding myths are rarely random. The Greeks could have claimed their city was founded by a triumphant hero. Instead, they chose a story about beauty, failure, death, and starting over in a beautiful place. Nearly 3,000 years later, that remains one of the most honest one-sentence descriptions of Naples ever composed. This city has never pretended that beauty and tragedy are separate things. Its own birth certificate says otherwise. So much for the legend. Now let us talk about what actually happened, because the real story is, in its own way, even better. The Greeks who came to this bay were not wandering adventurers. They were part of one of the most consequential migrations in ancient history. The great wave of Greek colonization that spread across the Mediterranean, roughly between the 8th and 6th centuries before the Common Era. Cities in Greece were growing crowded. Land was scarce, and so ships went west, carrying farmers, traders, and younger sons with no inheritance, all looking for a coastline to call their own. Some of the earliest of those ships came from the island of Euboea, and around the middle of the 8th century before the Common Era, they established a trading settlement on the island of Ischia, at the outer edge of this very bay. Archaeologists know it as Pithecusae, and what they have found there is remarkable. Among the graves, researchers recovered a simple drinking cup inscribed with one of the oldest known examples of the Greek alphabet. A few playful verses referring to the cup of Nestor from the poems of Homer. Think about what that object means. On a volcanic island at the far edge of the Greek world, someone was already making literary jokes in writing. These were not desperate castaways. They were literate, connected, ambitious people, and they were studying this bay very carefully. From Ischia, the Euboeans moved to the mainland and founded Cumae, widely regarded by historians as the first Greek colony on the Italian mainland, and it was settlers in the orbit of Cumae who established the small town on the headland by the Siren's grave. The dating is debated, with scholars placing the founding of Parthenope somewhere between the 9th and 7th centuries before the Common Era, but the location is not debated at all. That headland is the hill of Pizzofalcone, standing above the seafront of modern Naples. The area has remained inhabited, with remarkable continuity, ever since. But here is the question worth sitting with. Why here? Because to any careful observer, this bay should have looked unsettling. The ground itself said so. Black volcanic sand on the beaches, strange sulphur-smelling fields to the west of the bay, where the earth steamed and bubbled and occasionally glowed. The Greeks looked at those burning fields and concluded that they had found an entrance to the underworld. They set myths of giants and fire gods here, and they gave the zone a name that will matter enormously in the final act of this story: the Phlegreian Fields, the Burning Fields. Later, Roman writers placed the forge of the god Vulcan in this region. In other words, the ancient world looked at the Bay of Naples and sensed, through instinct and religion, something modern science now confirms with instruments. This ground is alive. They could see that the earth here was strange and powerful. Whether they understood the risk of a full eruption the way a modern geologist would is impossible to know, and we should not pretend otherwise. What is clear is that the rewards were impossible to ignore. Volcanic soil is a paradox. The same eruptions that can bury a landscape also load it with minerals, and over time that ground becomes some of the most fertile farmland in Europe. The slopes and plains around this bay produced grain, olives, and above all wine, in quantities that astonished visitors for centuries. Add a sheltered anchorage at the crossroads of Mediterranean trade routes, and the appeal of the place becomes obvious. Whatever the Greeks knew or did not know about the fire beneath them, they stayed. Nearly every generation on this bay since has made the same choice, right down to the commuters driving past Vesuvius this morning. That bargain sits at the centre of everything that follows. For roughly 2 centuries, Parthenope remained what it had always been, a modest trading town on a hill. Then, in the years around 470 before the Common Era, something changed. The Greek cities of this coast had just fought off a serious threat. The Etruscans, the powerful civilization of central Italy, had pushed south, and in a naval battle off Cumae in 474 before the Common Era, a Greek alliance defeated them decisively. The victory secured the bay for the Greek world, and in the confident years that followed, a new and larger city was laid out on the flat ground just east of old Parthenope. They called it, with perfect Greek practicality, Neapolis, the new city. Say that name out loud a few times, and you can hear it wearing down through the centuries. Neapolis, Napoli, Naples. The city you can visit today is, quite literally, still calling itself new after 2,500 years. There is something wonderfully Neapolitan about that, and the new city was built to last. Its Greek planners laid it out on a rational grid, 3 broad main streets running east to west, crossed by narrow streets running north to south. Here is the detail that should genuinely amaze you. That street plan is still there. Walk through the historic centre of Naples today, down the famous straight artery locals called Spaccanapoli, the street that appears to split the old city in two. And your feet are following lines drawn by Greek surveyors roughly 25 centuries ago. Rome has its ruins and its museums. Naples has something rarer. It has continuity. The ancient city is not preserved behind glass here. It is simply still in use, layer upon layer, with laundry hanging over it. That is why UNESCO calls Naples one of the most ancient cities in Europe, and why this story is different from the story of Pompeii. Pompeii is a photograph of a single terrible moment. Naples is a film that has never stopped running. By the late 5th century before the Common Era, Neapolis was thriving. It was a genuinely Greek city, with temples and theatres, Greek language, Greek festivals, Greek games, but it was a Greek city on Italian soil, and Italy was changing. Far to the north, a small republic on the Tiber River was beginning to expand, absorbing its neighbours one by one with a persistence the ancient world had never seen. Sooner or later, that republic's roads would reach the bay. The Greeks of Neapolis were about to face the question that would define the next 2,000 years of their city's life. What do you do when a greater power arrives at your gate? Fight it, surrender to it, or do something cleverer than either? Naples, as we are about to see, chose the third option, and it worked so well that the conquerors ended up falling in love with their conquest. Chapter 2. The Greek City in a Roman World. Rome did not arrive at the Bay of Naples with fire and sword. It arrived the way Rome so often did, with a treaty in one hand and an army standing quietly behind it. In the late 4th century before the Common Era, Roman power pushed south into Campania. Neapolis found itself in the path of a war between Rome and the Samnites, the tough mountain peoples of the interior, and after a siege, the city came to terms. Around 326 before the Common Era, Neapolis became an ally of Rome, and the terms, by the standards of the ancient world, were remarkably generous. The city kept its own laws, its own institutions, and above all its own language. Greek would still be spoken in the streets of Neapolis for centuries after Rome ruled the entire Mediterranean. Now stop and appreciate the strategy here, because this is the move that saved the city. The Greeks of Neapolis had watched other cities choose heroic resistance and be destroyed for it. They chose differently. They bet that Rome would value a loyal, useful, cultured friend more than a conquered ruin. They were right. When the Carthaginian general Hannibal rampaged through Italy a century later, crushing Roman armies and flipping Roman allies, Neapolis shut its gates and stayed loyal. Rome never forgot that. Loyalty, it turns out, can be a weapon too. But what happened next to the part nobody planned? Rome did not simply tolerate this Greek city. Rome fell for it. To an ambitious Roman, Greek culture was the mark of education and refinement, the way a European tour once functioned for wealthy Americans. And here was a genuine Greek city, with Greek theatres and Greek games, sitting just a few days from Rome, on the most celebrated bay in Italy. Neapolis and its coastline became the escape valve of the Roman elite. This was where powerful Romans came to take off the toga, sometimes literally, and live a little. The bay filled with pleasure villas. The dictator Sulla retired near here. Julius Caesar had property in the region. The great orator Cicero owned a villa by the bay and wrote letters complaining, in the way of wealthy people everywhere, about how busy his relaxation was. Emperors followed, Augustus visited the games at Neapolis. Nero, who fancied himself a singer, insisted on making his stage debut not in Rome, but in the Greek theatre of Neapolis, because only a Greek audience, he felt, could truly appreciate him. Roman sources record that an earthquake shook the theatre during those performances. The show, Nero being Nero, went on, and one poet made this coast his home in a way that would echo for 2,000 years. Virgil, the most celebrated poet of the Roman world, lived and worked in Neapolis while composing parts of his masterpiece, the Aeneid, the national epic of Rome. He loved this city more than he loved Rome itself. When he died in 19, before the Common Era, tradition holds that his remains were brought back to Neapolis and buried on its edge. And for centuries afterward, the site venerated as his tomb became a place of pilgrimage. Later generations of Neapolitans told stories about Virgil the magician, a wizard who protected the city with hidden talismans. Think about that. Naples so thoroughly adopted Rome's greatest poet that it turned him into a local guardian spirit. This city does not just survive its conquerors, it absorbs them. Meanwhile, at the western edge of the bay, something even more extravagant was happening. The burning fields the Greeks had feared as a gateway to the underworld had become, of all things, a resort. The town of Baiae, sitting directly on that steaming ground, used the natural volcanic heat to feed its bathhouses, and it grew into the most notorious luxury destination in the Roman world. Roman moralists wrote about Baiae the way tabloids write about Las Vegas. It was wealth, scandal, and pleasure, all simmering on ground, warmed by something no one understood. Because here is the irony hanging over this golden age. The Romans knew this region was strange. They could see the steam and smell the sulphur. They even harvested the ground itself, because the volcanic ash of this region, mixed into concrete, produced a material so strong and so resistant to seawater that Roman engineers used it to build harbours and domes that still stand today. Modern engineers still study that concrete. What the Romans did not know was what the burning fields actually were. Modern volcanology tells us that the western bay sits inside the Campi Flegrei, a vast volcanic system, a caldera, far larger than any single mountain. The most powerful people on earth built their spas on top of a sleeping giant, and they called it paradise. Hold on to that. In the final chapter of this story, the burning fields will move again. As for Vesuvius, the Romans barely worried about it. And honestly, why would they? The mountain was green to its summit, covered in some of the finest vineyards in Italy. Farms and towns crowded its slopes. The Greek geographer Strabo, writing in the 1st century, looked at the summit and noted that the rock appeared scorched, and he speculated that the mountain might once, long ago, have held fire. Once, long ago, in living memory, Vesuvius had never done anything but grow grapes. There were warnings, for anyone able to read them, in the year 62 or 63, by the accounts of Roman writers. A violent earthquake tore through the region, wrecking buildings in Pompeii and Herculaneum and damaging towns around the bay. The philosopher Seneca wrote about the disaster and wrestled with why the ground of Campania had shaken. People rebuilt, as people always do. Scaffolding was still up in Pompeii 17 years later. Modern scientists read that earthquake as a possible sign of a volcanic system coming back to life. The Romans read it as bad luck. So picture the bay in the year 79, the most sophisticated civilization in the Western world at the height of its power, a coastline of marble villas, fishing ports, market towns, and vineyards climbing a quiet green mountain. Tens of thousands of people living within sight of its summit. Not one of them knew what that mountain was. They were about to find out, and the world has never forgotten what happened when they did. Chapter 3. The day the mountain opened. We know what happened in the year 79, hour by hour, because one teenager wrote it down. His name was Pliny the Younger. He was about 17 years old, staying at his uncle's villa at Misenum, on the northwestern tip of the bay, across the water from Vesuvius, roughly 20 miles away. Years later, the historian Tacitus asked him for his memories, and Pliny answered in 2 letters that survive to this day. Those letters are widely regarded as the first detailed eyewitness account of a volcanic eruption to reach us from the ancient world. Modern volcanologists call this type of eruption Plinian, in his honor. What follows leans on what he actually wrote. One note of honesty before we begin. The traditional date of the eruption, passed down through copies of Pliny's letters, is the 24th of August. But archaeologists working at Pompeii have long noticed evidence pointing later in the year. Autumn fruits in the shops, heavier clothing, a charcoal inscription, and many scholars now argue for a date in the autumn, possibly October. The manuscripts disagree, and the debate continues. It is a useful reminder that even the most famous day in ancient history still holds open questions. What no one disputes is what happened when the mountain opened. In the early afternoon, Pliny's mother pointed out a cloud rising across the bay. Pliny describes its shape precisely. It rose on a tall trunk and then spread wide at the top, like one of the great Mediterranean pine trees. Today we would say it looked like a mushroom cloud, and we would be describing the same physics. A column of superheated gas, ash, and shattered rock was being driven miles into the sky. Modern estimates, based on the deposits, suggest the column reached heights on the order of 20 miles. His uncle, Pliny the Elder, was one of the most famous scholars in the Roman world, and he happened to command the imperial fleet at Misenum. His first reaction was a scientist's reaction. He ordered a ship prepared so he could examine the phenomenon up close. Then a desperate message arrived from a friend trapped near the mountain, and the mission changed. The admiral launched warships toward the disaster, steering for the shore that everyone else was fleeing. In what historians often describe as one of the earliest organized rescue operations on record, as hot ash and pumice rained onto his decks, his helmsman urged him to turn back. Pliny the Elder answered with a line his nephew preserved. Fortune favours the brave. Across the bay, the towns closest to the mountain were living the nightmare. Through the afternoon of the first day, pumice fell on Pompeii like a grey blizzard that would not stop. Roofs sagged under the weight, then collapsed. Thousands fled, others sheltered, waiting for it to end. Through that long night, the eruption column pulsed and wavered, and then it did the thing that turns eruptions into annihilations. Parts of the column collapsed, and avalanches of glowing gas and ash, hot enough to kill in an instant, swept down the mountainside at highway speeds. Scientists call them pyroclastic flows. Herculaneum, the small, elegant town under the mountain's western slope, was struck and buried deep. By the following morning, the flows reached Pompeii. The people who remained in the exposed parts of the city had almost no chance of survival. The excavated casts of their final moments have become some of the most haunting objects on earth. And if you have seen our film on Pompeii, you have already stood among them. Pliny the Elder never came home. He died on the shore at Stabiae. probably overcome by the volcanic gases and ash. The scholar who sailed toward the thing he wanted to understand. But this is the story of Naples. So now turn around and look at the catastrophe from the other side of the bay. In Neapolis, they saw everything. The column climbing into the sky, the strange darkness spreading over the water in the middle of the day, the lightning inside the cloud, at Mysenum, even farther out. Young Pliny describes the earthquakes intensifying through the night. The sea pulled strangely back from the shore, and then a black cloud rolling across the land toward them. He and his mother joined a panicked crowd on the roads in pitch darkness. He heard people crying for their families and voices declaring that the gods were gone and the world was ending in everlasting night. He admits, with disarming honesty, that he believed it too. And then, for Neapolis and Misenum, the darkness lifted. Sunlight returned to a world coated in grey ash. Looking, Pliny wrote, like a landscape buried in snowdrift. The city of the Siren was shaken and terrified, but it was alive. Why? The decisive factor was direction. The high winds during the eruption drove the ash columns southeast, over Pompeii and the towns on that side of the mountain, while Neapolis lay to the northwest, upwind of the worst of the fall. Distance helped too, though not as much as people often assume, since Naples sits only a little farther from the crater than Pompeii does. What mattered more was that the city lay outside the reach of the pyroclastic flows that did the actual killing. The surges that devastated the mountain's southern and western flanks. Wind, direction, terrain, and luck, working together. The oldest city on this bay survived the most famous natural disaster of the ancient world without ever being tested by its worst weapon. Survival on those terms is still survival, but it is not safety, and confusing the two would become a habit that lasted 2,000 years. In the months that followed, the region did what shattered regions do. Survivors from the destroyed towns resettled in communities across Campania, and some, it is reasonable to assume, came to Neapolis. Though the ancient sources do not give us their names or numbers, inscriptions and historical evidence indicate that the Emperor Titus responded with organized relief and reconstruction measures, with the property of families who died without heirs directed toward helping the stricken region. Pompeii itself vanished. Ash and time erased even its location, and its name faded into old texts. The mountain grew quiet, and eventually green again. Centuries passed. People returned to its slopes, because the soil was rich, and because human memory is shorter than a volcano's patience. The buried city would sleep for almost 1,700 years, waiting to become one of the most famous archaeological sites on Earth. And, strangely, one of the engines of Naples' golden age. That appointment is set for Chapter 8. But first, the world that built the villas and the warships had to die. Rome was mortal after all, and when the empire fell, this Greek city on the Italian shore would be left nearly alone, holding a lamp against a very long night. Chapter 4. The Last Light of Byzantium. Empires do not usually fall in a single day. They fade, the way a tide goes out, leaving the things they built stranded on the sand. In the 5th century, the Roman tide went out of Italy, and when it did, Naples was one of the things left standing. The dates historians usually cite tell the story in miniature. In 410, Rome itself was sacked by the Visigoths, an event that stunned the ancient world. In 476, the last Western Roman emperor was deposed, a teenager with the almost mocking name of Romulus Augustulus. Little Romulus Augustus, named for the founder of Rome and the founder of the empire, and master of neither. And here is a detail that connects that enormous moment directly to our story. According to the accounts that survive, the deposed boy emperor was not executed. He was pensioned off and sent to live out his days in a fortified villa by the Bay of Naples, on the site where, tradition holds, the Roman general Lucullus had once built his famous estate. Think about what that means. The Western Roman Empire, the power that had ruled this bay for 7 centuries, ended its story as a retiree in Naples. The city that Rome fell in love with became the empire's retirement home, in the most literal way possible. What followed for Italy was chaos measured in generations. Goths ruled, then the Eastern Roman Empire, which we call Byzantium, fought a devastating decades-long war to take Italy back. The historians of that war record a siege of Naples in 536 by the Byzantine general Belisarius, one of the great commanders of the age. Unable to break the walls, his soldiers found another way in, climbing single file through the channel of a broken aqueduct, emerging inside the defences by night. Mark that trick, because the tunnels under Naples will decide another siege 9 centuries later, and shelter the city itself 9 centuries after that. In this town, history does not only pile up in layers, it moves through them. Then a new people, the Lombards, poured over the Alps and seized much of the peninsula. City after city fell to them. The old Roman world of Campania shattered, but not Naples. The city's walls held, its harbour stayed open to the sea, and the sea led to Constantinople. Naples remained a Byzantine city, an outpost of the surviving Roman Empire in the east, when almost everything around it had fallen to the Lombard dukes of the interior. Look at a map of Italy around the year 700 and you will see it clearly. A great Lombard mass covering the south. And on the coast, a few defiant dots still connected to Byzantium. Naples was one of the brightest of those dots. And then, gradually, something interesting happened. Constantinople was far away, and its emperors had endless problems closer to home. In the 700s, the Duke of Naples began acting less like an appointed governor and more like a hereditary ruler. Historians generally point to the mid-8th century as the period when the Duchy of Naples became effectively independent. While still politely acknowledging the distant emperor, it was a very Neapolitan arrangement. Fly the flag of a faraway power and run your own affairs. That little duchy then survived for roughly 400 years. Sit with that number for a moment. 4 centuries. In America, 4 centuries takes you from the Mayflower to now. This small city-state, with no empire behind it and enemies on every side, navigated 400 years of Lombard princes, Frankish emperors, and Saracen raiders through diplomacy, tribute, and occasional hard fighting. The dukes of Naples made alliances, broke them, paid when they had to, fought when they had to, and at moments even allied with Muslim raiders against Christian rivals, a choice that scandalized popes and showed just how flexible survival can make a city. Life inside the walls during those centuries was hard, poor, and pious. The great Roman city shrank inside its own footprint, and the population, by the estimates historians offer for early medieval Italian towns, fell to a fraction of its ancient size. Yet the Greek language and Byzantine traditions survived here longer than in much of Western Europe, a legacy of those centuries facing east. And it is in this age that Naples bound itself to the figure who still watches over it today. His name was Januarius, in Italian, Gennaro, according to Christian tradition. He was a bishop who was martyred near Pozzuoli around the year 305. During the great persecution under the Emperor Diocletian, beheaded at the edge of the burning fields we have already visited. The traditions that grew up around him say his blood was gathered and preserved by the faithful. In the 5th century, his remains were brought to Naples, and over the centuries that followed, San Gennaro became the city's protector, its patron, its shield. And here we meet one of the most extraordinary living rituals in the Western world. In the Cathedral of Naples there is a sealed vial containing a dark substance that the church and the city hold to be the dried blood of San Gennaro. Several times a year, in a ceremony documented since at least the 14th century, the archbishop brings out the vial before a packed cathedral. The city waits, and on most occasions, the substance inside appears to liquefy, shifting from a dry mass to a liquid that moves. When it happens, Naples erupts in relief. When it does not happen, Neapolitans genuinely worry, because tradition links the failure of the miracle to years of misfortune, and believers point out that the blood is said not to have liquefied in some years associated with catastrophe, including 1980, a year this story will reach in time. Now, what is actually in that vial? The honest answer is that no one has been allowed to open it, and so no one knows. The Church has never made the miracle an official article of faith, and scientists have proposed natural explanations, including the hypothesis that a gel-like substance could liquefy when moved. Believers reply that the phenomenon does not behave consistently with those explanations. This film cannot settle that argument, and it will not pretend to. But here is what matters for our story, and it is not chemistry. For roughly 7 centuries of recorded history, the mood of an entire city has risen and fallen with the state of a substance in a glass vial. That is the emotional infrastructure of a place that lives on dangerous ground. And when Vesuvius returns to this story, San Gennaro will be carried out to meet it. By the 11th century, the old duchy was aging, and a new kind of soldier had arrived in the south. They came first as pilgrims and mercenaries, fighters from northern France, descendants of Vikings, the Normans, warriors from the same northern French military culture that conquered England in 1066 were, in those same decades, carving out states in southern Italy. Though these were separate ventures under separate leaders, they were formidable on the battlefield, and patient off it, un by un. The Lombard principalities fell to them. Sicily fell to them. The other coastal city-states fell to them. Naples held out the longest. The last independent duke watched the Norman kingdom consolidate around him like water rising around a rock. Finally, in 1139, the city accepted the inevitable, and Naples submitted to the Norman king Roger II. After roughly 400 years, the independent duchy was over, and this is one of the great turning points of the entire story. So mark it well, from 1139 until the 19th century. For the next 700 years, Naples would live inside kingdoms ruled from thrones, and almost every dynasty on those thrones would come from somewhere else. Normans, Germans, Frenchmen, Spaniards. The city that had outmaneuvered empires for a millennium was about to become one of the greatest prizes in Europe, fought over by everyone, and truly owned, perhaps, only by itself. But no one in 1139 could have guessed the twist. Naples entered the Norman kingdom as a proud provincial city, second in rank to gleaming Palermo. It would come out of the medieval centuries as a capital, one of the great cities of Europe, with a crown of its own. How that happened involves a brilliant emperor, a papal scheme, a French prince with an army, and a revolt sparked by church bells. That story starts with the most astonishing ruler of the Middle Ages. His enemies called him the Antichrist. His admirers called him the wonder of the world. Chapter 5. The Wonder of the World and the Making of a Capital. His name was Frederick II, and even his birth was theatrical. His mother, the heiress of the Norman kingdom, gave birth to him in a tent set up in the public square of a small Italian town, in front of witnesses, so that no one could ever claim the child was not hers. The boy united two mighty inheritances. From his mother, the Norman kingdom of Sicily and southern Italy; from his father, the German Empire. By the 1220s, Frederick was Holy Roman Emperor, King of Sicily, and the most powerful, most controversial man in Europe. Contemporaries did not know what to make of him, and historians have been arguing ever since. He grew up in the multicultural South, and by the accounts of his era, he spoke multiple languages, corresponded with Muslim scholars, kept a travelling menagerie of exotic animals, and wrote a treatise on falconry so precise that it is still cited as a landmark of observational science. He fought the popes so bitterly that he was excommunicated repeatedly, and propaganda on both sides reached apocalyptic pitch. His admiring contemporaries called him Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world. For our story, what matters is one decision. In 1224, Frederick founded a university in Naples. That may sound routine. It was anything but. Universities in that era grew up gradually, from cathedral schools and student guilds, over generations. Frederick simply willed one into existence by imperial decree, and he did it with a very specific purpose. He was locked in a struggle with the papacy, and the great University of Bologna sat in hostile territory and trained his enemies. Frederick wanted his own school, loyal to the state, training judges and administrators for his kingdom, free from papal influence. Historians often describe it as one of the earliest state-founded universities in Europe, an institution created by and for a secular government. And the university itself presents its charter of 1224 as making it among the oldest public universities in the world. 8 centuries later, that university is still open. It is called the University of Naples, Federico II. It still bears his name, and its most famous student walked its halls just a generation after the founding. A young Dominican friar from a noble family of the region studied there before going on to become the most influential philosopher of the medieval church, Thomas Aquinas. Consider what this means for our larger story. Long before Naples was a capital, before the palaces and the opera house, one of its great exports was thought. The city of the Siren became a city of the book, and it has never stopped being one. Frederick died in 1250, and the world he built came apart with terrifying speed. The popes were determined that his dynasty must be destroyed root and branch, and they went shopping for a champion willing to do it. They found one in Charles of Anjou, brother of the King of France, a cold, capable, relentlessly ambitious prince. The Pope offered him the southern kingdom as a papal fief. All Charles had to do was take it from Frederick's heirs. He did, with brutal efficiency. In 1266, Charles defeated and killed Frederick's son Manfred in battle. 2 years later, Frederick's grandson Conradin, a boy of 16, came south with an army to reclaim his inheritance. Charles beat him, captured him, staged a trial, and had the teenager publicly beheaded in a market square. And here is the detail that binds this dark episode to our city forever. That square was in Naples. The execution shocked Europe, even in a violent age. Killing a 16-year-old royal prisoner on a scaffold felt like the crossing of a line. Charles did not care. The Hohenstaufen line was finished, and the kingdom was his. Then Charles made the decision that changed everything for Naples. The old Norman capital was Palermo, on Sicily, an island Charles neither liked nor trusted. His ambitions pointed east, toward the Mediterranean and Constantinople, and he wanted his court on the mainland, closer to France and to his armies, so he moved the centre of the kingdom to Naples. After nearly 2,000 years as a survivor, a satellite, a duchy, Naples was suddenly a capital, the city transformed. Charles began a great fortress by the sea to house his court, the Castel Nuovo, the new castle, whose massive round towers still dominate the harbour front of Naples today. Money, officials, lawyers, and merchants flooded in. French nobles built palaces, the port filled with ships, and the population began a climb that would eventually place Naples among the largest cities in Europe. But Sicily had not forgotten being demoted, and it detested French rule. In 1282, at Easter, as church bells rang for evening prayers in Palermo, an insult offered by a French soldier to a local woman ignited an uprising. Within weeks, the Sicilians had massacred or expelled the French across the island. In the revolt, remembered as the Sicilian Vespers, the island crowned a rival king from the House of Aragon. Charles tried furiously to take it back, and failed. The kingdom split in two. From then on, the mainland realm ruled from Naples became known to history as the Kingdom of Naples. Born from an insult and a riot, that kingdom would exist, under one dynasty or another, for nearly 600 years. The Angevin century that followed was Naples' first true golden age, under Charles's grandson, King Robert the Wise. In the early 1300s, the court of Naples became one of the intellectual centres of Europe. Robert fancied himself a philosopher king, and the greatest artists and writers of the age passed through his city. The painter Giotto, the man usually credited with beginning the revolution that led to Renaissance art, worked for years in Naples, decorating the king's chapels and castle. The poet Petrarch, the most famous intellectual in Europe, was examined by King Robert personally before his crowning as poet laureate. And a young Florentine merchant's son named Giovanni Boccaccio spent his formative years in Naples, fell in love there, and set parts of the fiction that made him immortal in the city. Boccaccio would go on to write the Decameron, one of the founding works of European literature. He learned to tell stories, in no small part, in the streets of Naples. Some cities export goods. Naples, once again, was exporting imagination. The Golden Age did not last. The 14th century turned dark everywhere, and Naples suffered with the rest. The Black Death arrived in 1348 and killed on a scale the sources could barely record. Then the dynasty itself rotted. Queen Joanna I, Robert's granddaughter, reigned through decades of scandal, civil war, and accusation, including the murder of her own husband, a crime in which her enemies insisted she was complicit and which historians still debate. She was eventually deposed and, according to most accounts, murdered in her turn. Her successors fought each other into exhaustion. By the early 1400s, the Kingdom of Naples was a prize lying in the road, waiting for someone strong enough to pick it up. Someone was coming. In 1442, after a long siege, Alfonso, King of Aragon, called the Magnanimous, took Naples at last, and the manner of the taking closes a circle we opened in the age of Belisarius. Chronicle and legend agree that soldiers entered the city through the buried waterways, the ancient aqueduct channels under the streets, the same kind of passage the Byzantines had used 900 years earlier. Twice now, the underground city had decided the fate of the city above it. It would do so again. In the darkest year of the 20th century, the French house of Anjou was finished. The crown of Naples now belonged to the crown of Aragon, and the city was about to be pulled into the orbit of a rising world power, swelling into a metropolis so vast, so crowded, and so combustible that its story reads like a fever dream. Golden centuries and starving crowds, a new mountain born in a single week, a painter on the run from a murder charge, and behind it all, Vesuvius, silent now for so long that people had forgotten what it was. The forgetting was about to end. Chapter 6. The Spanish Colossus. Alfonso the Magnanimous entered Naples in 1442, the way a man enters a house he intends to live in, not a city he intends to loot. He rebuilt the Castel Nuovo and crowned its entrance with a magnificent white marble triumphal arch, carved in the new Renaissance style, celebrating his own arrival. That arch still stands today, wedged between medieval towers, and it makes a promise in stone. Naples, it says, will be a great capital again. Alfonso kept the promise. He genuinely loved the city, made it his favourite residence over his Spanish domains, filled his court with humanist scholars, and presided over what historians describe as one of the brilliant Renaissance courts of Italy. But his greater legacy was a fateful one. He had bound the crown of Naples to the crown of Aragon, and within 2 generations, Aragon was joined with Castile through royal marriage. The united crowns stumbled into the discovery of the Americas, and those Iberian kingdoms grew into the Spanish monarchy, one of the largest empires the world had yet seen. Naples, through no decision of its own, was now a possession of that empire. In 1503, after a final round of wars in which France and Spain fought over Italy like dogs over a bone, Spain won the southern kingdom outright, and Naples experienced something new in its long history. It stopped having its own king. For the next 2 centuries, the kingdom of Naples would be governed by viceroys, appointed governors sent from Madrid, each serving a few years and then rotating home. The capital of a kingdom, ruled by middle managers. Hold that thought, because the resentment it bred explains almost everything that happens in the next chapter. And yet, here is the paradox that defines this era. Under those foreign managers, Naples exploded. The numbers, as historians reconstruct them, are astonishing. By the mid-1500s, Naples had grown into one of the 2 or 3 largest cities in Europe, rivaled only by Paris and, later, London, by around 1600. Estimates, commonly cited, put the population at roughly 300,000 people, packed onto a footprint that had barely grown since the Middle Ages, which made Naples, by the reckonings of urban historians, among the most densely crowded places in Europe. To an American viewer, the best comparison might be this. Imagine the population of a modern city compressed into the street plan of a college campus, with no elevators, no plumbing, and no way out. Why did everyone come? Because the Spanish system, without meaning to, pulled them in. The empire taxed the countryside of southern Italy hard, and rural life grew desperate. But the capital had privileges, cheaper bread, royal courts, charity, and the sheer gravitational pull of a metropolis. So the poor of the south walked to Naples by the tens of thousands. The city absorbed them the way it had absorbed everyone else in this story. Imperfectly, chaotically, but endlessly. The Spanish tried to manage the flood. The most famous viceroy of the century, Don Pedro de Toledo, who governed for over 20 years in the mid-1500s, drove a great new straight street through the city, still called Via Toledo today, and lined the hillside above it with a grid of narrow streets built to house Spanish troops. That district is still there too. It is called the Quartieri Spagnoli, the Spanish quarters, and its tight alleys, hanging laundry, and vertical life remain, 5 centuries later, among the most photographed streetscapes in Italy. When you see those famous images, understand what you are looking at. Not a picturesque accident, but a military housing project from the 1500s that the city swallowed and made its own. And it was during Toledo's own years in power that the ground west of the city delivered a warning this story has been waiting for decades. The people of Pozzuoli, the old Roman port on the burning fields, had noticed something impossible. The land itself was rising. The sea was retreating from the waterfront. Wells shifted. The ground swelled as if something beneath it were breathing in. Then, in September of 1538, after days of earthquakes, the earth split open west of the town. In roughly 1 week of eruption, ash, steam, and volcanic debris built an entirely new hill where flat ground had been, a cone several hundred feet high that stands there still. The locals named it with stunned simplicity, Monte Nuovo, the new mountain. A village was buried beneath it, and accounts from the period record deaths among those who ventured too close. Toledo's government resettled the shaken population of Pozzuoli, and scholars of the day travelled to describe what they had seen. Now understand what you have just heard, because it is one of the most underrated facts in this entire story. The burning fields west of Naples are not merely steaming ground and old mythology. They erupted, in the age of the printing press, within sight of the city, and grew a mountain in a week. Then they went quiet. Vesuvius gets the fame, the postcards, and the fear. But the Campi Flegrei has erupted more recently than most people assume, and it has never stopped moving. File that away. The final chapter of this story comes back for it. Life in the Spanish metropolis, meanwhile, seethed with energy, sacred and profane. Hundreds of churches rose, glittering with gold and marble, funded by guilds and nobles competing for the favour of heaven, and the same streets hosted one of the largest urban underworlds in Europe. Beggars, smugglers, and gangs, part of the deep background from which, centuries later, organised crime in this region would grow. Into this furnace, in the year 1606, walked a fugitive. He was one of the most famous painters in Italy, and he was running from a death sentence. In Rome, he had killed a man in a brawl. His name was Michelangelo Merisi, known to history by the name of his hometown, Caravaggio. Naples took him in without blinking, because Naples asked fewer questions than Rome, and the city changed his art. Caravaggio's Roman paintings were already revolutionary. Real faces, real dirt, sacred scenes lit like crime scenes. But the works he produced in Naples, by the judgment of many art historians, plunged even deeper into darkness and mercy. For a charitable institution in the heart of the old city, he painted an altarpiece called the 7 Works of Mercy, cramming every act of human kindness into one crowded, torchlit Neapolitan street corner. That painting still hangs today in the exact place it was made for, a few steps off Spaccanapoli, in a small chapel you can walk into. Think about that continuity. In most of the world, a Caravaggio is a treasure behind museum glass. In Naples, it is simply still at work, 4 centuries later, doing the job it was hired to do. Caravaggio left, returned to Naples in 1609, was slashed across the face outside a tavern in an attack that may have been revenge, painted his final desperate masterpieces, and died in 1610 on his way to a hoped-for pardon. Naples keeps his shadows, and his influence lit a whole school of Neapolitan painters after him. Few cities look more like a Caravaggio painting than this one, and that is not a coincidence. He painted what he saw here. So take the measure of Naples around 1625, one of the biggest cities in Europe, a magnificent, overcrowded, overtaxed jewel of the Spanish Empire, a capital without a king, a population without room, an aristocracy without responsibility, and a treasury being drained to pay for Spain's endless wars. Historians looking back can see it plainly. This was a city built like a bonfire, dry wood stacked to the sky, waiting for sparks. And then came 3 sparks in one generation. The first came from the mountain, the second came from a fisherman, the third came from the sea, in the hold of a ship, and it would kill more Neapolitans than any other event in the city's recorded history. Chapter 7. Fire Above, Fever Below. By December of 1631, Vesuvius had been quiet for so long that its danger had passed out of living memory and into folklore. The last significant eruption noted in the records lay centuries in the past. Vineyards climbed the slopes again. Villages ringed the base. The mountain was simply scenery, exactly as it had been in the year 79. History was holding its breath. In the middle of December, 1631, the ground began to tremble. Wells behaved strangely. Then, on the morning of December 16th, the mountain tore open. A column of ash and gas climbed into the winter sky, and the nightmare of Pompeii, which no one alive had witnessed and few could even imagine, began again in front of a metropolis of 300,000 people. Over the following 2 days, by the accounts of the time, the eruption threw ash across southern Italy, and burning flows and mud flows swept down the slopes into the villages at the mountain's feet. Contemporary chronicles and modern studies of the event suggest a death toll on the order of 3,000 to 4,000 people, with some estimates running higher, which makes 1631 the deadliest eruption of Vesuvius since the destruction of Pompeii. Entire communities on the volcano's flanks were wrecked. Refugees streamed into Naples. Ash sifted down on the domes and bell towers, and the city stood at its windows watching the mountain burn. And then Naples reached for San Gennaro. The archbishop led enormous processions through the streets, carrying the relics of the patron saint toward the fire, an entire city praying at the top of its lungs. When the eruption subsided, Naples gave the credit not to luck or wind but to its defender. In the years that followed, statues of San Gennaro were raised facing the volcano, including a famous one on a bridge at the eastern approach to the city. Hand extended toward Vesuvius, forever ordering the mountain to stop. Whatever a viewer believes about miracles, understand what that statue really is. It is a border marker. On one side, the city of the living. On the other, the thing that kills. Naples drew that line in bronze and marble, and then went back to work. Here is the detail that should genuinely unsettle you. Though, after 1631, Vesuvius did not go back to sleep. It entered a phase volcanologists describe as semi-persistent activity, grumbling, glowing, and erupting on and off for the next 3 centuries. Naples spent roughly 300 years living with an active volcano on its doorstep the way a family lives with an unpredictable dog in the yard. Travellers came from across Europe just to see it glow at night. The danger had become a landmark, almost a pet. Remember that strange domestication, because in 1944 it ends, and the silence that follows is the silence Naples still lives inside today. The mountain was only the first blow. The second came from the streets, and it began over a basket of fruit. By the 1640s, Spain was drowning in war debt, and Madrid squeezed Naples without mercy. Taxes landed on everything, and in 1647 the government revived a tax on fruit, a direct strike at the daily bread of the poor. On the 7th of July, 1647, in the market square by the harbour, an argument over who would pay that tax boiled over. At the centre of the crowd stood a 27-year-old fish seller from the waterfront, a man with no title, no wealth, and no education. His name was Tommaso Agnello, and history remembers him as Masaniello. What happened next has fascinated writers for 4 centuries. The riot became an uprising, and the uprising, within a day or two, effectively handed control of one of the largest cities in Europe to a barefoot fisherman. The crowds burned the tax offices and the palaces of the financiers. But by most accounts, Masaniello tried to direct the fury rather than simply unleash it, ordering discipline, punishing looters, negotiating face-to-face with the Spanish viceroy for the abolition of the hated taxes for about 10 days in July, dressed at first in his fisherman's clothes and later in cloth of silver for negotiations. This young man was the most powerful person in Naples, and one of the most talked about people in Europe. It could not last, and it did not. The pressure of those days appears to have broken him. The accounts describe increasingly erratic behaviour, wild speeches, and paranoia, whether from exhaustion, betrayal, or, as some suspected then, and some historians consider possible, poisoning. On the 16th of July, men from his own movement shot him dead. His head was carried to the viceroy, and then, in a reversal so swift, it reads like theatre, the poor of Naples repented. The next day, an immense funeral filled the streets, with the same crowds that had abandoned him now honouring him as a martyr. The Spanish restored control within months, and the taxes crept back. So what was the point? Just this. The Masaniello revolt failed as a revolution, but it echoed for centuries as a story, retold in histories, plays, and even a famous opera. The tale of the fisherman king who made an empire blink. Naples had served notice, to Spain and to every ruler after Spain, that this city's obedience is rented, never owned. Every government that has ruled Naples since has known, somewhere in the back of its mind, that the streets are watching. That knowledge will return in this story, most gloriously in 1943. Then came the third blow, and it made the mountain and the revolt look small. In the spring of 1656, plague entered Naples, most likely carried by ship, and found the perfect hunting ground, one of the most densely packed cities in Europe, exhausted, unfilled, and crammed together lane upon lane. What followed that summer belongs among the worst urban catastrophes in European history. The disease burned through the tenements at a speed that broke every system the city had. Contemporary accounts describe bodies accumulating faster than they could be buried, mass graves, and caves and quarries beneath and around the city pressed into service as ossuaries. The exact toll can never be known, but historians commonly estimate that roughly half the population of Naples died within a matter of months, perhaps 150,000 people or more, from a city of around 300,000. Half a city, gone in one summer. There is nothing in American history to compare it to, and the deepest scar of 1656 may be what it did to the region's long-term prospects. The plague gutted the kingdom's population and economy for generations, at precisely the moment Northern Europe was accelerating into global trade and early industry. Some historians of Italy point to this catastrophe as one of the wounds that contributed, over the long run, to the widening gap between the Italian north and south, though how that gap formed, and when it became decisive, remains one of the most debated questions in Italian history. We will meet that question again at unification, where it belongs. Naples buried its dead, painted its plague columns, thanked San Gennaro for the survivors, and continued. By the end of the century, the population was climbing again. The churches were fuller and more golden than ever, and the city's ability to turn catastrophe into culture was about to receive its greatest opportunity, because Spain's long day was ending, and when the wars of the early 1700s redrew the map of Europe, Naples would wake up to find something it had not possessed in over 2 centuries, a king of its own, living in the city, answerable to no foreign capital. What that king's family would build, with opera houses and palaces and the greatest archaeological discovery of the age, would make Naples, for one dazzling century, one of the essential cities of the world. The Golden Age is next, and it begins, of all places, with a shovel striking a buried wall. Chapter 8. The Capital of Pleasure. The 18th century arrived in Naples, the way dawn arrives after a long fever. The wars of the Spanish Succession shuffled the map of Europe, and in 1734, a young prince rode into the city at the head of an army and changed its destiny. His name was Charles of Bourbon. He was the son of the King of Spain, but he did not come to govern Naples for Madrid. He came to take the crown for himself, and so, for the first time in over 200 years, Naples had what it had been denied for so long: a resident king, a real court, a capital that was once again the centre of its own world, not a province managed by rotating officials. Historians mark 1734 as the beginning of an independent kingdom of Naples under the Bourbon dynasty, and the city responded like a plant finally given water. Charles was, by the standards of the age, a builder-king of almost limitless appetite. Consider what rose during his reign of a quarter century. In 1737, he opened the Teatro di San Carlo, a royal opera house of a size and splendour Europe had rarely seen. And here is a fact worth savouring. The San Carlo predates the far more famous La Scala in Milan by about 4 decades, and it is still in operation, which makes it, by most reckonings, the oldest opera house in the world still performing today. Naples in this century developed one of Europe's most celebrated operatic cultures. A whole school of Neapolitan composers filled the theatres of the continent and the city's conservatories, which had begun as orphanages that taught music to abandoned children. Trained singers and composers who worked in London, Vienna, and Paris. Sit with that image for a moment. Naples took orphans, gave them music, and exported the results across Europe. Charles also began an enormous palace at Caserta, north of the city, planned on a scale meant to answer Versailles itself, with a facade over 800 feet long and a garden axis stretching for miles. And he founded royal factories for porcelain and silk, determined that his kingdom would make luxuries, not merely buy them. But the project that would carry the name of Naples across the centuries began not with an architect, but with a hole in the ground. For years, diggers and farmers near the mountain had been pulling strange marble fragments out of the earth. In 1738, under royal patronage, workers began tunneling in earnest at a site by the shore, and they broke into something impossible: a buried theatre, statues, painted walls, an entire Roman town, sealed in stone. It was Herculaneum. 10 years later, in 1748, excavations began at a second site inland, and slowly, trench by trench, the diggers realized what they had found: Pompeii, the city that vanished in the year 79, the city whose very location had been forgotten, was coming back into the light, and it belonged to the King of Naples. It is difficult to exaggerate what this did to the European imagination. The ancient world had always been known through texts and ruins, columns standing in fields. Pompeii was different. Pompeii was loaves of bread still in ovens, dice on tavern tables, political slogans painted on walls. The past, not as a monument, but as an interrupted afternoon. Word spread through the salons of Europe, and the finds from Herculaneum and Pompeii became one powerful current within the wider classical revival that reshaped architecture, painting, furniture, and fashion across the continent, and that would also help shape the look of the young United States, where the founding generation reached for columns and domes when they built a republic. And here is the part of that story most travel guides skip. Where did all of it go? The kings of Naples gathered the finds, along with the immense Farnese collection of ancient sculpture inherited through Charles's mother, and eventually housed them in a single building in the center of the city. Today it is the National Archaeological Museum of Naples, and it holds one of the greatest collections of Greco-Roman art anywhere in the world. The mosaics from the great houses of Pompeii are here, including the enormous mosaic of Alexander the Great in battle, made of more than 1 million tiny stone tiles. The bronzes from the Villa of the Papyri at Herculaneum are here. The everyday objects are here. The surgical instruments, the loaded dice, the carbonized bread. If you ever visit the ruins of Pompeii, understand this. You are walking through the empty rooms. The contents are 11 miles away. In Naples, waiting, and in the 1700s, the travellers came for all of it. This was the great age of the Grand Tour, the ritual journey through Europe that finished the education of wealthy young men, and increasingly women, from Britain and beyond. Rome was the tour's heart, but Naples became its unmissable climax. And the reasons read like a showman's poster: one of the largest and liveliest cities in Europe, a celebrated opera, the buried cities of the ancients, freshly opened, and looming over it all, an active volcano that visitors could actually climb. Vesuvius in this century was in one of its restless phases, glowing and erupting periodically, and watching it perform became a fashionable thrill. The British envoy in Naples, Sir William Hamilton, climbed the mountain dozens of times and sent detailed observations of its eruptions to the Royal Society in London, work that helped lay foundations for the science of volcanology. Naples, in other words, you spent the 1700s selling the very thing that threatened it, and the sale has never really stopped. By the second half of the century, under Charles and then his son Ferdinand, Naples was by most estimates the third largest city in Europe, behind only London and Paris. It had a peculiar social chemistry that fascinated every visitor who wrote about it. Splendor and poverty pressed together lane by lane. The famous street poor of Naples, the Lazzaroni. Thousands of underemployed men who lived by odd jobs and wit, alarmed and enchanted foreign writers in equal measure. Enlightenment philosophers taught in the university while, a street away, crowds waited for the blood of San Gennaro. Naples was not a contradiction that needed solving. It was proof that a city can hold everything at once. Then, at the century's end, the age of pleasure met the age of revolution, and the meeting was written in blood. In 1789, France exploded. The ideas of liberty and equality raced across Europe, and educated Neapolitans, lawyers, professors, reforming nobles, caught fire with them. The Bourbon court, tied by marriage to the very Austrian royal family whose daughter Marie Antoinette died on the guillotine, swung hard toward repression. When French armies marched into Italy, the collision became unavoidable. In 1799, with French troops approaching, the king and court fled to Sicily, and Neapolitan republicans proclaimed a new state, the Parthenopean Republic, taking the city's most ancient name for its newest idea. The republic lasted about 5 months, and its fall is one of the tragedies of the age. The poor of the city, devoted to king and saint, never embraced the revolution of the educated, and when a royalist army raised in the countryside marched on Naples, the Lazzaroni fought the republicans street by street. The republic surrendered on terms that promised safe conduct. Those terms were then set aside, a decision in which the British Admiral Horatio Nelson, whose fleet supported the king, played a role that historians have debated and criticized for over 2 centuries. The reprisals that followed were merciless. Over 100 republicans were executed, including some of the finest minds in the kingdom, scientists, jurists, and one of the most remarkable women of the age, the writer Eleonora Fonseca Pimentel, who had edited the Republic's newspaper and went to the scaffold with witnesses recorded, unshaken dignity. The Bourbon Restoration of 1799 did more than kill a republic. It opened a wound between the crown and the thinking class of the South that never fully healed, and it taught a generation of Italians that reform within the old kingdoms might be impossible. Some historians trace the long road to Italian unification, the road that ends this kingdom entirely, back to the scaffolds of 1799. The kingdom had 6 decades left to live. They would be crowded ones. An emperor from Corsica was redrawing Europe, and his shadow was already falling across the bay. Chapter 9. The Kingdom That Vanished. Napoleon Bonaparte treated thrones the way other men treat furniture, moving them, replacing them, handing them to relatives. In 1806, his armies took Naples. The Bourbons fled once again to Sicily under British protection, and the emperor gave the crown first to his brother Joseph, and then, in 1808, to his brother-in-law, a man who might have been invented by a novelist, Joachim Murat, the son of an innkeeper from southern France, who had risen through sheer battlefield brilliance to become the most famous cavalry commander in Europe. Murat was brave to the point of theatre, vain about his uniforms, and, to the surprise of many, a serious reformer. The French decade changed the machinery of the kingdom in ways the Restoration never fully undid. Feudalism, the ancient legal order that had bound southern land and peasants to noble privilege for centuries, was formally abolished. Law codes were modernized, administration centralized, careers opened to talent. Murat founded schools and public works, and he understood, better than the Bourbons ever had, the power of national feeling. In 1815, as Napoleon's empire collapsed, Murat gambled everything on that feeling. He issued a proclamation calling on all Italians to unite in a single nation. It was decades too early. His army was beaten, and later that year, attempting a desperate landing in Calabria to reclaim his kingdom, he was captured by Bourbon forces and executed by firing squad. According to the accounts of his death, he refused a blindfold and gave the order to fire himself, asking the soldiers to spare his face. Even his enemies conceded that the innkeeper's son died like a king. The Bourbons returned, and in 1816 the old realm was legally reorganized as the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, uniting Naples and Sicily under one crown. What followed was a strange half-century, and honesty requires telling it in two voices, because historians themselves are divided about it. Here is the case for the kingdom. It was, by the standards of Italy, a state of real achievements. In 1839 it opened the first railway on the Italian peninsula, a short line from Naples to the royal palace at Portici, running almost in the shadow of Vesuvius. Naples had one of the larger merchant fleets in the Mediterranean, early steamships, engineering works, and at the shipyards and factories around the bay, some of the most substantial industrial establishments in Italy. The city itself remained the largest in Italy by population, a true European capital with its opera, its university, and its scientific institution, including, from 1841, that volcano observatory on the slopes of Vesuvius from the opening of our story, the first institution of its kind anywhere, founded by a Bourbon king to study the mountain that shared his kingdom. And here is the case against the kingdom was also, especially after the revolutions of 1820 and 1848 were crushed, one of the most politically repressive states in Europe. Constitutions were granted under pressure and revoked. Police surveillance was pervasive, and political prisoners filled the jails in conditions that became an international scandal when the British statesman William Gladstone, after visiting Naples, published letters in 1851 denouncing the Bourbon government in a phrase that echoed across Europe, calling it the negation of God erected into a system of government. Supporters of the dynasty answered that Gladstone had been fed exaggerations by the opposition, and historians still argue over how fair the portrait was. But the damage to the kingdom's reputation was immense and permanent. Educated Europe came to see the Two Sicilies as a police state with an opera house. Meanwhile, to the north, the Kingdom of Piedmont was industrializing, arming, and positioning itself as the engine of Italian unification. The peninsula was drifting toward a single question: would Italy be made, and who would pay the price of the making? The answer arrived by sea. In May of 1860, wearing a red shirt, Giuseppe Garibaldi was already the most famous revolutionary alive, a guerrilla legend of two continents who had fought in South America and in the sieges of Italy's failed revolutions. That spring, with about 1,000 volunteers, poorly armed and travelling in two commandeered steamships, he landed in western Sicily to raise the island against the Bourbons. What followed remains one of the most improbable military campaigns of the modern era. The 1,000. joined by swelling crowds of Sicilian volunteers, beat professional armies many times their size. City after city fell. By September of 1860, Garibaldi crossed to the mainland, and resistance dissolved in front of him. And then came the 7th of September, 1860, one of the strangest days in the history of any capital. The young Bourbon king, Francis II, had withdrawn from Naples the evening before to make a final stand to the north, sparing the city a battle. Garibaldi was at Salerno, his army still a day or more behind him, and the general made a decision of pure theatrical nerve. He boarded a train. By the accounts of that morning, Garibaldi rode into Naples by rail with a handful of companions, ahead of his own forces, into a city of over 400,000 people that still held thousands of royal troops. He was betting that the crowd, not the garrison, held the real power in Naples. He was right. The city met him not with bullets, but with a roar. Church bells, and a sea of people. Witnesses describe him riding through streets so packed his carriage could barely move, while soldiers of the king looked on and did nothing. The largest city in Italy, capital of a kingdom 7 centuries old, changed hands in an afternoon to a man who arrived, essentially, on public transportation. The Bourbon army fought on bravely at the river Volcano and in the fortress of Gaeta, where the young king and queen endured a long bombardment before surrendering in February of 1861. That same spring, the Kingdom of Italy was proclaimed. In the plebiscite of October 1860, the official count showed an overwhelming vote in the south for joining Italy. Though historians note the open voting conditions of the era make such totals hard to read as free expression in the modern sense. However, one reads the numbers. The fact was accomplished. After more than 700 years, counting from the Norman crown, the southern kingdom ceased to exist. Naples, a capital since the 1260s, woke up as a provincial city in someone else's country. Its court gone, its ministries gone, its role gone. Was unification a liberation or a conquest? Be careful with anyone who answers that question quickly, because Italians themselves have argued about it for a century and a half. One tradition tells it as redemption, the sweeping away of a repressive relic by the tide of national freedom. Another tradition, with renewed scholarly attention in recent decades, points to what came after. Some southern industries declined in the new unified market, while historians continue to debate how industrial the Bourbon South had truly been. And when the modern gap between North and South became decisive, a brutal decade of unrest in the southern countryside, called brigandage by the state and civil war by some later historians, was suppressed by the new Italian army at a cost in lives that scholars still debate. What is beyond debate is that the wealth gap between North and South hardened into the defining fracture of modern Italy, argued over to this day under the name of the Southern Question. And what no one disputes is what the people of the South did next. Denied prosperity at home, they made the most consequential decision in the modern history of the region. They left, in numbers the modern world had rarely seen. And the story of where they went is not only the story of Naples, it is the story of New York, of Boston, of New Orleans, of the country many of you watching are sitting in right now. That exodus, and the food, the fever, and the farewell ships that shaped it, is next. It begins with the most famous flag ever placed on a piece of dough. Chapter 10. Pizza, Cholera, and the ships to America. Let us begin this chapter with the single most famous thing Naples ever gave the world. It is not a palace, not an opera, not a saint. It is a flatbread with toppings. And the story of how it conquered the planet says everything about what happened to this city after unification. Flatbreads are ancient, and versions of them existed around the Mediterranean for millennia. But pizza, in the sense the world now means it, dough, tomato, cheese, sold hot and cheap and fast, took its modern form in the poorest streets of this city. The tomato itself was an American plant, brought back from the New World by the Spanish, and it was in the crowded lanes of Naples, across the 17 and 1800s, that the poor married it to bread and made the marriage permanent, for generations. Pizza was street food for people with almost nothing, sold from open stalls, folded and eaten standing up, sometimes bought on credit. Wealthy Italy looked down on it. Foreign travellers described it with fascination and occasionally with horror. It was fuel for the lazzaroni, food with no pedigree at all. Then, in 1889, came the moment every history of food repeats. The new king and queen of Italy, Umberto and Margherita, visited Naples, and according to the story, a celebrated pizza maker named Raffaele Esposito was summoned to prepare pizzas for the queen. He made several kinds, and the one the queen preferred carried tomato, mozzarella, and basil, red, white, and green, the colours of the new Italian flag. The pizza was named in her honour, and the Margherita was born. Now, a moment of honesty, because that is how this channel works. Food historians have examined this story hard, and several details wobble under inspection. Pizzas with tomato and mozzarella existed before 1889. The documentary trail around the famous visit is thinner than the legend suggests, and some scholars regard the naming story as brilliant early marketing as much as fact. So treat the tale the way historians do, as a legend wrapped around a truth. And the truth is bigger than the legend. Whatever happened in that kitchen, the symbolism was real. A queen of the country that had just absorbed Naples, putting the national colours on the food of the Neapolitan poor. The conquered city fed its conqueror, and the dish would eventually outgrow them both. Because here is the twist that makes this a global story. Pizza did not conquer the world from Naples. It conquered the world from America. And to explain how, we have to talk about why millions of people abandoned the land this entire story has been about. The decades after 1860 were bitter ones in the South. The old capital had lost its court, its ministries, and much of its economic reason for being. The countryside, squeezed by taxes and cheap foreign grain, slid toward crisis. And then the city itself suffered a catastrophe that stripped its problems naked in front of the world. In 1884, cholera swept through Naples. The disease found the oldest, lowest, most crowded quarters of the city, where families lived packed in windowless ground floor rooms, and it killed thousands within weeks, by the accounts of the time. Newspapers across Europe and America covered the horror. The young kingdom of Italy was shamed into action, and the response became one of the largest urban renewal projects of the century, known as the Risanamento, literally the making healthy again. Over the following decades, whole districts of the old city were demolished. A grand new boulevard, the Reticolo, was driven through the medieval fabric from the train station toward the centre. New sewers and a new aqueduct, bringing clean mountain water, transformed public health, and that aqueduct remains a foundation of the city's water supply today. But the risanamento carried a shadow, and honest history has to weigh it. Critics at the time and historians since have documented that the demolitions destroyed communities as well as slums, that many of the displaced poor were pushed into equally crowded quarters just out of sight, and that speculation enriched contractors while the deepest poverty simply moved. If that pattern sounds familiar to American viewers who know the story of 20th century urban renewal in cities like Boston or New York, it should. Naples ran that experiment decades early, with results just as mixed. And for hundreds of thousands of families across the South, the calculation at the end of the 1800s was simple and merciless. The old kingdom was gone, the new Italy was hungry, and the ships were waiting. What followed was one of the largest migrations in modern history. In the decades between roughly 1880 and the First World War, millions of Italians left their country, and the South supplied a huge share of them. The port of Naples became the great funnel of that exodus, the last piece of Italy under millions of pairs of feet. Steamships left the bay packed with farm labourers, artisans, mothers carrying infants, teenagers travelling on a cousin's promise, bound above all for the United States. At the peak years in the early 1900s, Italian arrivals in America ran into the hundreds of thousands per year. They landed at Ellis Island, and they built the little Italys of New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, and New Orleans. Try to feel the scene at the harbor, because statistics numb what they should sharpen. A family sells what cannot be carried. They travel to Naples, sometimes seeing their capital city for the first time in their lives, and spend a last night in a boarding house by the port. In the morning, the medical inspections, the tickets checked, the gangway, and then the deck of a crowded steamer, and the view that emigrant memoirs from this coast so often describe: the city climbing its hills, the castle on the harbour, and Vesuvius, sliding slowly below the horizon. For millions of people, the last image of the old world was the mountain at the centre of this story. It had watched the Greeks arrive nearly 3,000 years earlier. Now it watched their descendants leave. The emigrants carried Naples with them, and America was never the same. They carried the songs, and this is the era when Neapolitan song conquered the world's ears, with melodies like O Sole Mio, composed in 1898, becoming, through emigrant singers and later through stars like Enrico Caruso, the Naples-born tenor who became one of the first global recording superstars. Some of the most recognized music on earth. They carried the food. Pizza crossed the Atlantic in emigrant kitchens, and by most accounts, the first pizzerias in the United States appeared in New York's Italian neighborhoods in the early 1900s, with Lombardi's in Manhattan, licensed in 1905, usually cited as the first, though food historians note that informal pizza baking in emigrant bakeries almost certainly came earlier. For half a century, pizza remained a neighborhood specialty of Italian America. Then post-war prosperity, returning soldiers who had tasted it in Italy, and the automobile age found it, and the food of the Neapolitan poor became, by the 21st century, one of the most popular dishes on the planet. When you order a pizza tonight, and statistically some of you will, you are completing a transaction that began in hardship, in a region that could not offer enough of its children a future, and so sent them, and their recipes, across an ocean. By 1915, the emigration decades had remade both shores of the Atlantic. Naples itself remained what it had been since unification, one of the largest cities in Italy, proud, musical, overcrowded, and underpowered. A former capital still learning to be a province, it had survived the century of humiliation the only way it knew. By exporting its genius and absorbing its losses, it would need every ounce of that resilience for what came next, because the 20th century was about to arrive in earnest, and it was carrying total war from the sky. And then, as if the mountain had been waiting for the darkest possible moment, one last eruption. Chapter 11. The 4 Days. The First World War took its southern sons and gave little back. Naples sent its young men to the Alpine front, mourned its share of Italy's roughly 600,000 dead, and emerged into the post-war chaos that broke Italian democracy. By 1922, Benito Mussolini and his fascist movement were marching on Rome, and it is a detail worth remembering that the final rally before that march was held in Naples itself, where Mussolini gathered tens of thousands of black shirts in October of 1922. The South did not invent fascism, but like the rest of Italy, it submitted to it, and for 2 decades Naples lived under the regime, its port militarized, its poverty dressed up for parades, its emigration safety valve slowly closed by American immigration restrictions in the 1920s. Then Mussolini chained Italy to Hitler's war, and Naples discovered what its geography was worth in the age of the bomber: a great port, a rail hub, and an industrial zone, within range of Allied aircraft. Beginning in 1940 and intensifying brutally from 1942, Allied bombing raids struck the city again and again. By the counts of historians, Naples endured on the order of 200 air raids across the war, making it one of the most heavily bombed cities in Italy. Thousands of civilians were killed, whole quarters near the port were shattered, and treasures of 7 centuries burned, including the medieval church of Santa Chiara, gutted in the raids of August 1943. The population went underground, and here this story folds back on itself across 2,000 years. The tunnels and cisterns beneath Naples, the quarries the Greeks cut, the aqueducts the Romans ran, the passages that soldiers had used to take the city in 536 and again in 1442, became the bomb shelters of the 1940s. Tens of thousands of Neapolitans slept in the yellow stone galleries under their own streets, in chambers their ancestors had carved. Some shelters held bunks, chapels, scratched drawings that survive today. The oldest layers of the city saved the newest. Naples survived the most modern form of war by hiding inside its own foundations. By September 1943, Italy was breaking. Mussolini had been deposed in July. On the 8th of September, Italy's surrender to the Allies was announced, and the German army, no longer an ally but an occupier, seized the country. In Naples, the occupation turned savage almost immediately. The German command imposed forced labor roundups, seizing men and boys off the streets for work service, and announced reprisals for any resistance. Historians of the occupation record executions of Italian soldiers and civilians in those September days, and plans to strip the port and industry bare. What happened next had few parallels in occupied Europe, and it remains the proudest 4 days in the modern history of this city. Beginning around the 27th of September, 1943, and exploding into full revolt on the 28th, the people of Naples rose against the German army, not a trained underground with a command structure. The city itself, dockworkers, ex-soldiers, women, and, in numbers that astonished witnesses, teenagers and boys. Some of them, the street kids called Skugnizi, attacked German patrols, threw up barricades, seized weapons, and fought house to house. The uprising is remembered as the Quattro Giornate, the 4 days of Naples. Accounts describe furious fighting around the stadium, the working-class districts, and the approaches to the port, with captured German prisoners exchanged for Neapolitan hostages. By the 1st of October, when Allied forces entered Naples, the Germans had pulled out of a city they could no longer hold. Naples is often described by historians as the first major European city to drive out its German occupiers by popular revolt, before its liberators arrived. The cost, by the commonly cited counts, ran to several hundred Neapolitan dead, and the city was later awarded Italy's gold medal for military valour. Remember Masaniello, 3 centuries earlier, and the lesson every ruler of Naples eventually learns. This city's obedience is rented. In September of 1943, the lease expired. The Germans left a poisoned farewell, demolitions and mines that kept killing for weeks, including delayed bombs that destroyed buildings after the liberation. The winter that followed was among the hardest in the city's memory. Naples in 1943 and 44 was a wrecked port, crammed with Allied soldiers and refugees. Its economy reduced to barter, black market, and improvisation. The British intelligence officer Norman Lewis, stationed in the city, recorded that world in his memoir, Naples 44, a book still read today. And what stunned him was not only the misery but the vitality, a population inventing survival hour by hour and somehow keeping its humour while doing it. And then, as if history had decided the scene needed one more author, the mountain woke up. In March of 1944, with the war still raging just to the north, Vesuvius began its largest eruption in decades. Lava flows descended the slopes and destroyed the villages of San Sebastiano and Massa di Somma, while ash columns rose over a bay full of Allied shipping. The eruption killed, by the commonly cited figures, around 24 people, and it delivered one blow that belongs uniquely to this war. At an airfield near Pompeii, the falling ash and volcanic debris caught the American 340th Bombardment Group on the ground, and by the unit's records and the accounts of historians, the hot ash damaged or destroyed dozens of B-25 bombers where they stood, with some accounts placing the total number of aircraft affected near 80. It was a loss on the scale of a whole group, inflicted not by the Luftwaffe but by geology. American servicemen photographed the eruption, shoveled ash off wings, and wrote home about watching a volcano join the war. Then Vesuvius did something it had not done in 3 centuries. It stopped, completely. The eruption of March 1944 ended the long era of semi-persistent activity that had begun after 1631, the centuries of grumbling and glowing that travellers had climbed to see. The plume that had watched the emigrant ships went out. Since 1944, Vesuvius has been silent. Now, an untrained ear hears that sentence as simple good news. A volcanologist hears something more complicated. According to the Vesuvius Observatory and Italy's National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology, the INGV, the volcano is not extinct but quiescent, in a closed conduit phase. Its alert level at base green. The scientific literature on Vesuvius also notes a pattern in its long record, that extended periods of repose have sometimes been followed by larger eruptions than short ones, which is one reason the monitoring never relaxes. What the current silence means for the future, no one can say with certainty, and this film will not pretend otherwise. What can be said is that the silence is exactly what the instruments from our opening scene are listening to, every hour of every day. In 1945, the war ended, and Naples stood among the ruins doing what it had done after Romans, plagues and revolutions, counting its dead, feeding its children, and starting again. Ahead lay a half-century that would test the city in a subtler way than bombs, through corruption, crime, earthquake, and neglect. And then, against most predictions, one of the more surprising urban comebacks in Europe, that fall and rise, with a soccer god from Argentina in the middle of it, is next. Chapter 12. The Beautiful Mess. Peace came to Naples in 1945, the way a tide comes to a wrecked harbour, revealing everything that was broken. The port was shattered. Tens of thousands of homes were rubble or ruin, and the city that had liberated itself now had to feed itself. What followed over the next half-century is the hardest part of this story to tell honestly, because it is a story of real failure and real magic tangled together so tightly that separating them would falsify both. Neapolitans themselves have a phrase for their city that translates roughly as a beautiful mess, and it is hard to improve on. Start with the rebuilding, because the rebuilding set the pattern. Italy's post-war decades brought the so-called economic miracle, and money did flow south. Through state funds created to develop the southern regions, Naples grew explosively. But how it grew became a national scandal. In the 1950s and 60s, city administrations tied to speculators handed out building permits like confetti, and concrete poured across the hills and the coast with minimal planning and, by the findings of later investigations and the judgment of most urban historians, systematic corruption, green space vanished. Neighbourhoods rose without services. The scandal became so notorious that it produced a landmark of Italian cinema, the 1963 film Hands Over the City, which dramatized the corrupt politics of Neapolitan construction and won the top prize at the Venice Film Festival. The film was fiction. The problem was not. Italians gave the era a name, the Sack of Naples, and the city still lives inside the concrete that era left behind. And in the poorest districts, an older shadow grew stronger. Organized crime in the Naples region, known as the Cholera, has roots that historians trace back at least to the 1800s, a street-level underworld of smuggling and protection that every government since the Bourbons had fought and none had killed. The disruption of the war years, the black market, and then the flood of post-war construction money fed it into something far more dangerous. By the 1970s and 80s, Camorra clan ran contraband cigarettes, then narcotics, then public contracts, and fought wars among themselves that killed hundreds. It must be said plainly and fairly. The Camorra is a criminal minority battening on a law-abiding majority, and its most relentless enemies, the police, magistrates, priests, and journalists who confront it, are themselves overwhelmingly Neapolitan. But its weight on the city's economy and reputation across these decades was, by every serious account, immense. And here is where a documentary can accidentally lie by omission. So let us correct the record. If you had walked those same streets in those same decades, the sound you would have heard most often was not gunfire. It was laughter, because while the headlines filled with concrete and crime, Naples was producing some of the greatest comic art in Europe. Two names carry it. The first is Antonio de Curtis, known to every Italian simply as Toto, a Neapolitan actor of aristocratic pretensions and rubber limbs who made around 100 films and became Familian, the funniest man his country ever produced, a performer whose timing came straight out of the street theatre of his own city. The second is Eduardo de Filippo, playwright, actor, and one of the major figures of 20th century European theatre, whose plays, written largely in Neapolitan, turned the cramped apartments of this city into stages for the whole human condition. His comedy Napoli Milionaria, first staged in 1945, put the black market and the ruined families of the war years in front of audiences who had just lived through them. His masterpiece, Filumena Marturano, from 1946, about a former prostitute forcing a wealthy man to acknowledge his sons, became one of the most performed Italian plays in the world, and was later adapted into an Oscar-winning film. Understand what this means. In the very years the city was being robbed by its own contractors, it was also giving the world a body of comedy about dignity, survival, and family that outlived every one of those contractors. Sit down anywhere in the historic centre today and you can still feel the same instinct at work. Order an espresso at a bar in Naples and you may be told your coffee has already been paid for by a stranger who left earlier and bought an extra. Neapolitans call it the caffè sospeso, the suspended coffee, a small local custom of buying a drink for someone you will never meet, described by writers as an old habit of the city, revived and celebrated in recent decades, in a place with this much hardship in its history. That gesture is not sentimentality, it is a rule for how to live among other people. Then, as if the century had not tested the city enough, the ground itself moved. It was a Sunday evening, November 23rd, 1980, a mild night at the end of a soccer afternoon, families at supper, churches finishing evening mass. At about 7:34, the mountains of Irpinia, east of Naples, tore loose in an earthquake that lasted well over a minute, an eternity by the standards of seismology. In the city, buildings swayed, facades cracked. An apartment block in one working-class district collapsed, and the population poured into the streets and squares, where many spent the night in cars and on benches, afraid to go back inside. But Naples had received only the edge of it. In the epicentral villages of the interior, whole towns had ceased to exist. The earthquake killed, by the commonly cited official figures, around 2,700 people or more, injured thousands, and left hundreds of thousands homeless at the start of winter. Italy's president went on television days later, visibly furious, to denounce the slowness of the first rescue efforts, a broadcast that became a famous moment of national conscience, and the aftermath became a second scandal, as reconstruction funds on an enormous scale were diverted and siphoned over the following decade. In what Italian investigators and journalists documented as one of the great corruption episodes of the Republic, for believers in San Gennaro, 1980 carried one more dark footnote. It is remembered as one of the years the blood did not liquefy. So by the early 1980s, the ledger looked grim, a wounded, indebted, crime-burdened city, mocked in the northern press, losing its young to emigration once again. And it is precisely at this lowest point that Naples received the strangest gift in its modern history. Not a king, not a saint, but a soccer player. In the summer of 1984, the city's club, Napoli, paid a world record fee to sign Diego Armando Maradona, a short, brilliant, turbulent genius from the poor outskirts of Buenos Aires, by wide consensus one of the greatest players who ever lived, Tens of thousands of fans filled the stadium just to watch him be introduced. What followed became one of the legendary chapters in the history of sport. In 1987, Napoli won the Italian championship, the Scudetto, for the first time in its history, the first time a club from the deep south had ever won it. The city did not celebrate so much as detonate, with festivities that ran for days and passed instantly into folklore. A second championship followed in 1990, along with a European trophy in 1989. An American viewer might reasonably ask why a sports title belongs in a serious history. Here is why. For over a century, since unification, Naples had absorbed a national narrative in which the North won and the South lost. In wealth, in politics, in respect. The Scudetto of 1987 was experienced by the testimony of countless Neapolitans as the day the scoreboard finally read otherwise, in front of the whole country. Maradona's story in Naples ended painfully, with scandal and addiction and a bitter departure in 1991, and the city has long since made its peace with both halves of the tale. When he died in 2020, Naples mourned as if for family, and the stadium where he played now bears his name. And quietly, beneath the noise of those decades, something else was stirring. In 1995, the historic centre of Naples, that layered Greek and Roman and medieval city we have walked through this entire story, was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Recognition that one of the most ancient urban fabrics in Europe had survived everything the 20th century had thrown at it. In the 1990s, a reforming city government pedestrianised the great seafront, scrubbed monuments, and staged an international summit in the restored royal spaces. Visitors began, cautiously, to return. The underground city opened for tours, and Neapolitans themselves went down into the Greek quarries and wartime shelters and came back up with a renewed sense of what they were standing on. None of it erased the problems. The garbage crisis of the 2000s, when collection collapsed and trash piled in the streets while investigators traced Camorra involvement in the waste industry, made global headlines and became, for a while, the world's lazy shorthand for Naples. Unemployment stayed stubbornly high. The beautiful mess remained a mess. But the century's verdict, read fairly, is this. Between 1945 and 2000, Naples was betrayed repeatedly by speculators, by criminals, by parts of its own political class, and it outlasted them all, through the stubborn vitality of its people and the sheer depth of its own past. The city entered the new millennium battered, unbeaten, and about to experience two things almost no one predicted. The first was a renaissance. The second was a message from underground, from the one direction nobody had been watching. Because while every eye in this story has been fixed on Vesuvius, the ground on the other side of the city has been slowly, measurably, rising. Chapter 13. The Fire Beneath the Bay. By now you have absorbed the central image of Naples, the city and the mountain, 3 million people, and Vesuvius, among the most closely watched volcanoes on Earth. Its silence since 1944, monitored every hour by the institution, founded on its slopes in 1841. That danger is real, and we will weigh it properly in a moment. But now this story has to keep a promise it has been making since Chapter 1, and return, at last, to the burning fields. Cast your mind back across everything you have heard. The Greeks who feared the steaming ground west of the bay and named it the Phlegrean Fields, an entrance to the underworld. The Romans who built the pleasure city of Baiae on that same ground and called it paradise, San Gennaro, martyred at its edge. The impossible week in 1538, when the earth near Pozzuoli split open and built Monte Nuovo, a brand new mountain, in front of witnesses. Every one of those threads belongs to a single geological fact. The western side of the Bay of Naples sits inside the Campi Flegrei, a volcanic caldera roughly 8 by 9 miles across, a sunken system formed by cataclysmic eruptions tens of thousands of years ago, including one, roughly 40,000 years back, that ranks among the largest eruptions known in the Mediterranean region. Part of the caldera lies under the sea. The rest lies under the towns of the Western Bay, and under the western edges of Naples itself. Roughly 500,000 people, by the figures used in Italian civil protection planning, live inside its designated red zone. Read the map plainly, and the shape of this whole story changes. Vesuvius stands beside Naples. The Campi Flegrei lies beneath part of it. And unlike Vesuvius, the burning fields are not silent. The caldera breathes. Scientists call the phenomenon bradyseism, slow earth movement. And the town of Pozzuoli is the world's textbook example. The evidence is carved into antiquity itself, in the ruins of the Roman market at Pozzuoli. The marble columns are bored through at height by the holes of marine shellfish, proof that those columns spent long ages partly underwater before the ground lifted them out again. The land here has been an elevator, moving up and down through recorded history. In the early 1970s, and again in the early 1980s, that elevator moved sharply, raising the ground by several feet, shaking the town, and forcing the evacuation of tens of thousands of people from Pozzuoli's old centre. No eruption followed. The ground settled. The people came back. That outcome is part of the record too, and it matters for reading what is happening now, because something is happening now. Beginning around 2005, the instruments recorded a new phase of uplift, and it has not stopped. According to the public monitoring bulletins of the INGV, Italy's National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology, the ground in the Pozzuoli area has risen well over a metre in this current phase, and the uplift continues at a rate measured in millimetres per month. With the rising ground have come earthquakes, many thousands of them, most too small to feel, and in recent years some of the strongest recorded in the area during the modern monitoring era. In 2025, the caldera produced shocks reaching magnitude 4.6, and on the evening of the 31st of July, 2026, a magnitude 4.7 earthquake struck near the Solfatara crater at Pozzuoli, described in the first official reports as the strongest recorded in the area in roughly 4 decades. More than 20 people were reported injured. Buildings were damaged. The port of Pozzuoli was closed. Rail service across the Naples area was disrupted, and many residents spent the night outdoors as aftershocks continued. As this film was completed in early August of 2026, official inspections and assessments were still underway, and those figures may have been revised since. So here is the honest scientific picture, stated with the care this subject demands, and drawn from what the INGV and Italy's Civil Protection Department have publicly communicated. The current unrest does not mean an eruption is imminent. The official alert level for the Campi Flegrei is yellow, meaning attention and enhanced monitoring, and the authorities have repeatedly stated that no eruption is imminent. Calderas can rise, shake, and subside again without erupting, exactly as this one did in the 1980s. Many current models attribute the uplift to pressurization by hot fluids and gases in the shallow system. potentially influenced by deeper magmatic processes, though the exact balance among those factors remains under active study. Evacuation plans for the Phlegrean Red Zone have been updated, and public exercises have been held in the towns. No responsible scientist will tell you an eruption is coming soon, and none will tell you it is impossible. What the bulletins say, month after month, is that the system is restless, that it is watched, and that preparation is not panic. And Vesuvius itself, the picture there is quieter, but the stakes are, if anything, larger. The volcano remains at base alert level green, yet the emergency planning around it is sobering in its very existence. Italian civil protection maintains an official red zone on and around the mountain, the area exposed to the worst effects of a possible eruption, and the national plan provides for the evacuation of roughly 600 to 700,000 residents over a matter of days, using twinning arrangements that pair each Vesuvian town with a region of Italy that would receive its people. Think about what that document is. It is a standing plan to move a population the size of a major American city, written in the hope it will never be used. Updated because it might be, now hold that reality in one hand, and in the other hand hold what Naples has actually been doing in these same years. Because the strangest fact of the early 21st century is that, while the ground trembled, the city soared. Over the past decade and a half, Naples has experienced what travel economists and journalists have widely described as a tourism boom without precedent in its modern history. Visitor numbers reported by regional authorities and the press have multiplied. The historic centre now crowds with travellers from everywhere, and the city has repeatedly ranked among the fastest-growing destinations in Europe. The engines are many: the UNESCO-listed Old City, the Archaeological Museum and the ruins beyond it, the underground tours, where visitors walk the Greek quarries and wartime shelters. This story has descended into 3 times. The food, above all, with Neapolitan pizza riding a global wave that crested in 2017, when UNESCO inscribed the art of the Neapolitan pizza maker, the pizzaiuolo, on its list of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity. Screen culture played its part too, as the worldwide success of Neapolitan stories, including the novels of Elena Ferrante and the television adaptations filmed in the city, sent readers and viewers to see the real thing, and the myth machine delivered again. Twice. In 2023, Napoli won the Scudetto for the first time in 33 years, the first since the Maradona era, and the celebrations, watched around the world, showed a city that had spent those decades learning to host its own joy. Then, in May of 2025, Napoli won it again, a 4th championship, and this time the party had a different flavour, less disbelief, more confidence. The boom has brought its own arguments, of course, about rents and crowds, and whether the old centre risks becoming a stage set. The same arguments every beloved city now has. Naples being Naples, it conducts those arguments loudly, in the street, while carrying trays of espresso through the crowd. Some things are simply constant. So this is Naples in 2026, a metropolis of roughly 3 million people, heir to nearly 3,000 years of urban continuity, seat of one of the oldest universities in the world, home of the oldest opera house still performing, keeper of a saint whose blood the city still gathers to watch, 3 times a year, a city booming and trembling in the same season. Its 2 volcanic neighbours watched by some of the finest earth scientists alive. One silent since 1944, one measurably moving under the western towns. Few places on earth live with this particular combination of age, beauty, and geological suspense, which leaves only the question this entire film has been walking toward. Why do they stay? Return, one last time, to that handsome old building on the slope of Vesuvius, the historic observatory, founded in 1841, now a museum, while the institution it began watches on through its modern network, sensor by sensor, bulletin by bulletin. All through this story, we have treated it as an image of vigilance, humanity keeping its eye on the danger. But now that you know the whole story, look again, because the meaning has changed. That building is not really a watchtower. It is a treaty. It is the written form of an agreement this city has renewed, generation after generation, for nearly 3,000 years. The agreement says, we know what this ground is, and we are staying anyway. Everyone in this story signed it. The Greeks signed it when they buried a siren on a volcanic headland and planted vines in the ash. The Romans signed it when they built their pleasure palaces on the steaming fields of Baiae. The people who lived through the year 79 signed it when they rebuilt their lives within sight of the mountain that had just erased Pompeii. The processions of 1631 signed it, carrying San Gennaro toward the fire instead of running from it. The families of Pozzuoli sign it today, every time they repair a crack. Read the latest bulletin and stay. And the emigrants signed it hardest of all, because even the millions who left carried the city with them, and their great-grandchildren now fly back across the Atlantic to find it. And here is what they all understood, the thing this whole story has been trying to say. The danger and the gift were never entirely separate. The volcanic soil fed the city. The volcanic landscape helped shape the bay and the coastline that sheltered its ships. The buried cities became the treasure that drew the world. The hard centuries forged the culture, the music, the food, the comedy, the unkillable street-level genius that travelers now cross oceans to touch. Subtract the fire from this story and you do not get a safer Naples. You get no Naples at all. That is not recklessness. It is a wager about what a life is for, and Naples has been making it, and mostly winning it, for nearly 3,000 years. Rome fell and was refounded. Other ancient cities shrank to villages and grew back. Naples simply never stopped. Through Caesar and Belisarius, through Frederick and Charles, through Masaniello and Garibaldi, through the bombers and the black winters, the lights along this bay have never all gone out at once. They are on right now, somewhere down there tonight. A pizzaiuolo is sliding a margherita out of a wood-fired oven the way his great-grandfather did. A student is walking home along a street the Greeks surveyed. A stranger is paying for a coffee that another stranger will drink tomorrow. And in a monitoring room on the bay, a screen is drawing a thin, steady line, and a scientist on the night shift is reading it, so that 3 million people can sleep without reading it themselves. The mountain is patient, the fields beneath the bay are moving, and the city between them is doing what it has always done, living, loudly, in one of the most beautiful and dangerous places on earth, beside the very forces that made it possible in the first place. If this journey moved you, the story of the city Vesuvius did not spare is waiting for you in our film on Pompeii, and the comments below are open. Tell us honestly, would you live on this bay? The instruments are still listening. We will see you in the past.